Ever wonder how a simple cup of coffee could end up costing you, like, double, thanks to something called a tariff?
You wouldn't think something like a cup of coffee would be affected by global trade policies.
Right. But today we're going to do a deep dive into the world of tariffs, these taxes on imported goods. They've shaped American history in some pretty surprising ways. From way back when, they were basically how the government paid for everything,
Oh, yeah. Before income tax, the government relied heavily on tariffs.
to even playing a part in huge events like the Civil War
That's right. Tariffs have always been kind of a hot button issue economically, A&D, politically, both domestically and internationally.
and even the Great Depression.
It's fascinating how something that seems straightforward, like it's just a tax on stuff coming in from other countries, can have such a big impact.
Totally. So, to help us unpack all of this, we've got a whole stack of sources, articles, economic journals. We've even got some old presidential campaign platforms to look at.
Sound like fun.
We're going to uncover the origins of tariffs, how they work, and their lasting impact on today's trade landscape.
Definitely some aha moments in store for our listeners.
For sure. So maybe first, let's get on the same page about what exactly a tariff is.
Yeah, sure. So in the simplest terms, it's a tax that's imposed on goods coming in from other countries. And this tax is paid by the businesses importing the goods to their own WN government, not to the country where the goods are coming from.
So like if a company here in the U.S. wants to bring in, let's say, those delicious Colombian coffee beans, they have to pay the U.S. government a tariff just for the right to import them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And these tariffs, they can take different forms. You've got the ad valorem tariff, which is a percentage of the value of those goods. So, for example, if there's a 10% ad valorem tariff on a $100 imported shirt, that'll add an extra $10 to its cost.
Gotcha. So the price goes up to the importer, and likely that increased cost gets passed on to us, the buyers.
Right. And then you've got the specific tariff. That one's a fixed amount per unit, like, say, a $5 tariff on every barrel of imported oil, no matter what the price of oil is.
Okay, that makes sense. So different types of tariffs for different situations.
Now, think about this. Go way back to the early days of the United States, around 1790 to 1860. Back then, tariffs were the main way the federal government brought in money.
Wow, so before we had income tax, it was tariffs that funded what? Basically everything, like infrastructure projects, the military.
Everything. It's wild, right?
That is wild.
The government's financial structure was completely different back then. They relied so much on these import taxes, averaging something like 20% on most goods.
And did every single item imported to the U.S. have a tariff attached to it?
Pretty much. In fact, the very first Tariff Act signed by, George Washington himself back in 1789 imposed a 5% tariff on almost all imports.
Wow. George Washington. That's pretty significant. So, okay, it seems like tariffs back then were a lot more than just a way to make money,
Yeah.
right? I mean, there had to be other reasons why they were so popular back then.
You're right. And one of the biggest supporters of tariffs back in the day was Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury. He saw tariffs as absolutely crucial for helping young American industries grow. Like, it was a way to protect them from the competition with those big, powerful European industries that were already well established.
So it's kind of like leveling the playing field for American businesses,
Yeah.
giving them a fighting chance to grow.
Exactly. In his report on manufactures from 1791, he argued that without tariffs, American industries would just get swamped by cheaper imports from Europe, and that would basically prevent them from ever being able to compete.
So this idea that tariffs help new industries get started is sometimes called the infant industry argument, right?
Yeah. And, that argument, that infant industry argument, it's still around today. People still bring it up when they talk about trade policy.
And it makes you wonder if, protecting those early American industries with tariffs actually helped the U.S. become the manufacturing powerhouse it is today.
It's a really complex question, and historians still debate about exactly what role tariffs played. But one thing's for sure, tariffs definitely had a big impact on how different regions within the U.S. developed. And sometimes, those impacts weren't what people were hoping for, like with the Tariff of Abominations back in 1828.
Oh, yeah. The Tariff of Abominations. Even the name sounds bad. What exactly happened with that one?
Well, this Tariff Act, it really hiked up those rates, sometimes to like 50% on certain goods.
Hmm.
And the problem was it ended up mostly benefiting industries in the North, and it put a real strain on the South.
Yeah, I can see how that would cause problems. The South was really reliant on imported goods and on exporting their agricultural products. It must have felt like they were getting a raw deal.
Exactly. And the Tariff of Abominations, it really showed how tariffs could create these big regional differences within the country and even make political divisions worse.
And I'm guessing this wasn't the last time that tariffs caused controversy in American history.
Oh, you're absolutely right. The Tariff of Abominations, it was just the beginning. Like, as we move through the 19th century, we see tariffs popping up again and again as a major point of conflict, especially in the years leading up to the Civil War.
So tariffs weren't just about, like, economics, right?
Yeah.
They got tangled up in some pretty big political and social issues, too.
Exactly. The debate over tariffs got even more intense as the nation was dealing with things like states' rights, slavery, and how the economy was developing in different regions. The South really started to see those high tariffs as like a tool that the North was using to get richer at the expense of Southern farmers.
So it sounds like tariffs almost became a symbol of this growing divide between the North and the South.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Southern planters, they relied a lot on imported goods, and they were really worried that high tariffs would make everything they needed to buy more expensive. And at the same time, they were worried it would be harder to sell their cotton to other countries.
And what about the North? What was their take on tariffs during this time?
Well, up north, things were getting more and more industrialized, and a lot of people there saw tariffs as, essential for protecting their factories and businesses from foreign competition. The Republican Party was new then, and led by Abraham Lincoln, of course, and they made high tariffs a central part of their platform.
So things were pretty much set for a big clash over tariffs. And, well, we know how that turned out. The country ended up in the Civil War, and tariffs were definitely one of the things that contributed to it.
It's a powerful example of how economic policies, even something like a tariff, can have these huge and unexpected consequences. They can actually shape the course of history. And, the debates about tariffs didn't end with the Civil War. Decades later, during the Great Depression, there's the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, and that's probably one of the most infamous examples of what can happen with protectionist policies.
Smoot-Hawley. Yeah, that one's like a textbook case of how economic policies can go wrong.
Yeah.
What's the story there?
Okay, so imagine this. It's the Great Depression. The whole world is struggling, right? Unemployment is going through the roof. Businesses are shutting down left and right. It's just like a really desperate time. And the U.S., they're trying to figure out how to protect American jobs and industries. So they decide to, really crank up those tariffs with this Smoot-Hawley Act.
So the idea was if we make foreign goods super expensive, Americans will have to buy stuff made here in the U.S.
Right.
And that'll help boost the economy.
Right. Sounds pretty logical, doesn't it?
It does.
But here's the thing. It totally backfired. Instead of helping the U.S. economy, Smoot-Hawley ended up triggering a whole bunch of retaliatory tariffs from other countries.
So it's like everyone started putting up walls, trying to protect their own economies, and global trade just went, like, kaput.
Pretty much. Global trade plummeted, and a lot of economists, they believe that Smoot-Hawley actually made the Great Depression even worse. Like, it was supposed to help, but it ended up hurting even more.
Oof. It's like a classic case of how these protectionist policies can have all these unintended consequences. They try to help, but they end up hurting the very people they're supposed to be protecting.
Yeah, it's a tough lesson. It really shows you how interconnected the global economy is. And it also shows you how risky it can be to try and isolate yourself from the rest of the world. And, this brings us to a really interesting shift in how the U.S. approached tariffs. For a long time, the U.S. was all about protectionism, using tariffs to shield its industries from competition. But after World War II, things started to change. There was a gradual move toward advocating for free trade.
So what caused this shift in thinking? Why the change of heart?
Well, I think World War II played a big role. It was so devastating, right? And it really made people realize how important global cooperation is. The U.S. came out of the war as like a major economic powerhouse. American industries had grown and matured to the point where they could compete internationally. They didn't need as much protection anymore.
So it's like the U.S. wasn't an infant economy anymore. It was ready to play in the big leagues in a more open global marketplace.
Exactly. And this new way of thinking about trade led to the creation of international agreements like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or RAT, back in 1947.
In Garrity, it was all about reducing tariffs and other trade barriers around the world, right? And it eventually became the World Trade Organization, or the WTO.
Yep, that's right. These organizations, they've been really important in making global trade more free and open. They've helped to bring down tariffs, and they've encouraged more international trade. But of course, this whole shift toward free trade, it wasn't without its critics. People were worried about jobs being lost in certain industries, and they were worried about the impact on the environment and about, workers being exploited in developing countries.
So basically, the debates about tariffs and trade policy, they're still going on today, right?
Oh, absolutely. They never really stopped. Modern trade agreements like NAFTA and the one that replaced it, the USMCA, they try to find a balance. They want to promote free trade, but they also want to address those concerns about domestic industries and workers.
So it sounds like tariffs, even though they've been around for centuries, they're still a big deal in today's globalized world.
They are. We see tariffs being used as bargaining chips in trade negotiations as a way to deal with concerns about unfair competition, and sometimes, even as weapons in trade wars.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into tariffs, what are some of the main things we've learned from looking at their long and sometimes kind of messy history?
Well, I think one of the big takeaways is that tariffs, they're almost never just about economics. They're tied up with politics, with social issues, and even with national security concerns.
We've seen how they can be used to protect industries here at home, how they can be used to raise money for the government, and how they can even be used to try to influence what other countries do. But we've also seen how they can lead to unexpected consequences, how they can spark trade wars, and how they can sometimes make economic hardship even worse.
The history of tariffs, it shows us that even policies that seem simple, like putting a tax on goods, can have ripple effects that go way beyond what anyone intended. And those effects can really shape the course of history in ways we can't always predict.
It makes you wonder, what does the future hold for tariffs? Especially as the world becomes even more interconnected. Are they going to stick around? Are we going to see more trade wars? What do you think?
It's tough to say for sure, right? Like over the last few decades, we've seen this trend toward more open trade. Let's focus on tariffs. But then something happens, like, people get worried about the economy or there's some kind of global tension, and boom, tariffs are back in the spotlight.
Yeah, it's like this back and forth between wanting open markets and wanting to protect our own industries. And who knows what'll happen next.
It's hard to predict. What I find really interesting, though, is how those early arguments about tariffs, like the stuff Alexander Hamilton was saying, it still comes up today. He was talking about protecting infant industries back then, but the U.S., it's definitely not an infant economy anymore.
But those ideas, they still have power, don't they? They still shape how we think about trade, even though the world has changed so much since Hamilton's time.
For sure. So if we take a step back and look at the big picture, what have we learned from all this tariff history?
Yeah, what are the big takeaways?
Well, one thing that really jumps out is that tariffs are rarely a simple fix. I mean, you put a tariff on something and you think it's going to solve a problem, but often it just creates a whole bunch of new problems. It can have consequences you never even thought of, and there are always winners and losers. And sometimes those tariffs, they can even trigger those trade wars, which just makes things worse for everyone.
So it sounds like policymakers, they're always trying to find that sweet spot, right? That balance between free trade and protecting their own industries.
Exactly. And it's tricky. You have to weigh the benefits of being open to trade against the need to make sure your own industries and workers are doing okay. And what works one time might not work another time. There's no magic formula.
So as we're all trying to make sense of this complicated world of tariffs and trade, what should we be thinking about? Are there some guiding principles we can use?
Well, one thing that's really important is understanding history. If we look back at what worked and what didn't work in the past, we can get some really valuable insights into, what might happen with different trade policies.
It's like that old saying, those who can't remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Exactly. We need to remember those mistakes, like Smoot-Hawley and all those other times when protectionism went wrong. But we also need to remember that tariffs, they can be useful sometimes. If they're used in a really strategic way for a specific purpose, this can be helpful.
So it's about finding that balance, using tariffs in a responsible way to achieve certain goals without causing too much damage.
Right. And it means understanding how the global economy works, how everything's connected, and how other countries might react if you start messing with tariffs.
It sounds like there's a lot to think about. and it's not always easy to predict what's going to happen.
That's for sure. The world of trade is always changing, and there are always new challenges popping up. But if we can have good conversations about this stuff, learn from the past, and really try to understand how complex it all is, then maybe we can figure out how to make things work better for everyone.
Well said. I think that's a great place to wrap things up. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of tariffs. We hope you learned something new about their history, their impact, and how they still matter in today's world. And until next time, keep exploring.